Good evening and welcome to the first of our live New Networks for Nature 2020 events online. So this is our Q&A session following the pre-recorded panel on new perspectives on nature writing. So I'm really pleased to have with me here the nature writer and editor, Jessica J. Lee, the novelist and nature writer, Jean McNeil, and the poet, Mona Arshi. They're joining us again after having recorded the panel. I hope you've all had a chance to see the panel. So we are broadcasting on YouTube here. And for those of you at home, you'll see there's a chat box on your right on the screen there. And we would really welcome any questions you might have for our speakers about what they had to say. You can just type them in the chat there and click send, and they'll come up on our screen. And I will put those questions to our speakers. But while we give you a chance to have a think at home about your questions, perhaps I'll kick off with a question to get us going. We began this panel thinking about nature writing at scale, nature writing that engaged with nature on a sort of planetary scale, on a more than just the local and the national scale. And I've been struck by, and I've enjoyed reading in your work, a kind of a freshness to nature. And I was reminded by there's an essay by Aldous Huxley called Wordsworth in the Tropics, which kind of explores, or it's Huxley thinking about Wordsworth's idea of nature in relation to a very different nature in Asia, in the jungles of India. And he kind of says maybe this idea of a British Wordsworthian nature isn't so universal after all. And I guess my first question is really about how your sense of nature has been enlarged and has been challenged, and with engagements with landscapes that might not be the familiar British landscapes that we might recognise from the new nature writing. Maybe Jessica, would you like to respond a little bit to that?
Yeah, happily. So it's one of those things that I think has always sort of troubled in the background of my thinking, this idea of that inherited sense of British landscape as being so, I think, dominant in all of our conversations around nature writing. I grew up in Canada. So I think I grew up with a very different sense of landscape. But I grew up in Canada in a British family, and with, I spent a lot of time with my Welsh grandparents growing up. And I think, one of the things I've given a lot of thought in recent years is how much we import those landscape ideals basically anywhere within the Commonwealth, and how much that was carried over in a lot of places. And, there've been a lot of studies of this, that, plants, for example, and landscape management styles traveled in both directions, right? And so you get this recreation of English landscape in places that are very far flung. And, we also get plants brought in that are non-native here. And so I don't know, I think it's one of those things that I'm constantly very mindful of as being a framing that I think I feel I still quite unsettled about. There's so much about landscape in Britain that I adore. And then sometimes it makes me very uncomfortable to think that that's the lens I take with me when I'm in places that are not here. So it's particularly working on my book in Taiwan was really helpful in terms of undoing that kind of thinking, and undoing also what would otherwise be a sort of exoticized or othering lens for looking at landscapes elsewhere.
Great. Jean, that it's taken to extremists in the Antarctic as well, where nature is certainly not what we're used to here.
Yeah, I think, I mean, everything that Jessica said resonates with me because I also grew up in Canada. And actually, just I'll come to the Antarctic, but very briefly, I realized that my early education had absolutely no influence whatsoever from the British Isles. At that point, it was all about regionalism and localism. So I learned a great deal about actually indigenous literatures, for example, but I had no idea about British landscape, like zero, apart from reading Thomas Hardy, perhaps. So it's a landscape that I've had to learn by rote as I've learned others. And with regard to the Antarctic, yeah, all one's suppositions or desires, even, I didn't realize I had so much desire circulating around landscape, have to be totally rethought in the Antarctic, because there is no landscape. And I don't think that's a judgmental thing to say, but there really is. It's very, very reduced, and you can't interact with it safely very easily, or in a very, very specific way. So the landscape doesn't come toward us. We have to go to meet its reality. And it's a sort of, it turns the usual power dynamics of domesticated landscapes on its head. And the other paradox is, you mentioned the new nature writing. It's really interesting how nature writing is so culturally conditioned and very prevalent in this country. But the paradox is that this is one of the most denatured landscapes in the world, the British Isles, and yet there is this flourishing of appreciation, it would seem, or this kind of reconstruction effort going on in nature writing. So yeah, my takeaway is I'm not from this landscape, and that sharpens one's eye whenever you're having to deal with landscapes that are unfamiliar and perhaps even threatening. You sharpen up very quickly as an observer.
Yeah, absolutely. Mona, you've been working in a landscape much closer to home, but I wonder even if you've experienced a sense in which your idea of nature might have been challenged by the Clyde Marshes environment. And just to say, you're still on mute, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jean, Jessica, really interesting. So I think that I come from sort of my encounter with even British landscape comes from a sort of different space. My encounter really is rooted in this sort of diasporic approach. So, and it's a kind of resistance in some way and a pull towards it at the same time. And I think that comes from the kind of migration which ends up being quite economic migration, actually, that ends up being quite an urban experience. And then there is a sort of safety in the urban. But at the same time, a lot of that, those communities were coming from agricultural spaces, from quite wild spaces. And so there's a sort of push and pull. So, and I find that really interesting, because when I am now encountering the British landscape, there is a sort of way of feeling quite sort of foreign in a country that I was born in. So, and then what do I do with that feeling, that kind of, that very strange feeling of feeling sort of familiar and foreign in this space? And actually, what I've done, I realized, is that I think that those are kind of quite interesting spaces to work in, actually. So those, to center some of those experience in the landscape is interesting. And I think that's why language and using language and thinking about language that I've, my mother tongue languages, and how I'm responding to that in those spaces, has been quite strange, but also really interesting, sort of tapping into what's happening there.
Great, thank you. Yeah. We have a question here from Caritas. Hi, Caritas. Caritas would like to hear your thoughts on the links between nature writing, travel writing, and migration writing. What would you say unites and divides these genres? Good question. I'll leave that open to
I can jump in. I can jump in. I would say off the bat that all of these genres, I'm not entirely sure that distinctions between them are helpful. I think we have stylistic and sort of formal distinctions that emerge between them because of what we've seen historically. But I think going forwards, it's not a very helpful distinction because they're all centered on land. And the second we start talking about land, we need to be talking about migration. And so for me, you know, I'm not a huge fan of the travel writing label, which I get lumped in quite often. Like the second we start to talk about landscape, about place, about, you know, not just non-human nature in those places, but our own relationship to it, that's a question of belonging always, right? So that to me means that they're very similar sort of things. We can't really separate them out necessarily.
Jean or Mona, did you have anything to offer to that question?
Yeah, I can jump in very quickly, which is to say, I think there's really just writing. I mean, travel writing, migration writing, they're sort of helpful labels in perhaps a commercial sense. And actually they've emerged relatively recently. And travel writing has now been, if not discredited, then re-questioned in a post-colonial sense, because really the question behind it is who gets to travel, you know, who has the resources to travel and therefore pronounce upon places. And it has been a relatively select coterie of people who've been able to do that. And that's where maybe migration writing is a bit more of an awareness or an acknowledgement of the politics of moving and also the politics of land, as Jessica said. So I think it's about focus. Yes, there are different thematic focuses on this, but I think really we're all trying to figure out what is our relationship with the land, with the non-human realm or the more than human realm. And that's what all this writing ultimately tackles.
Great, thanks, Jean. Mona, did you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, I am a poet that I'm sort of approaching landscape in a particular way, but when I'm approaching landscape, what's interesting is that I sort of the themes around migration and who owns language are things that are kind of important. So I think I have learned from nature writing and that is talking to those themes. So and travel writing as well. I mean, I'm sure that those things are I would be able to use those in my writing, but they're not things that I generally turn to when I'm writing.
More questions that have come in now. One from Julia Bell. Julia says she's interested in Jean's point about British nature writing flourishing in a very denatured environment. Why do you think this is? Is it a kind of cultural nostalgia stroke propaganda?
Well, Jos has written the book on this in some ways. I think, Jos, you should answer.
Oh gosh, I wasn't expecting to be answering the questions myself.
No, maybe not. But yeah, I think this is definitely your territory.
Is it nostalgia? Interesting question in a denatured environment. Okay, so there was an article published recently by Graham Huggan about nature writing as a form that is kind of kicking against its own form. It's inheriting a form that was kind of pastoral and nostalgic, and at the same time, it seems to be resisting that form as it's trying to engage with a much changed and denatured environment. So it's still embodying some of those old pastoral forms, but it's also kicking against them. And Graham Huggan kind of says that there's an odd sort of anachronism there that feels a little unwieldy, a little uncomfortable. And I share that to an extent, but I also think that's one of the really exciting things about nature writing is the way that it's always trying to struggle for a new form for the changed world that it's exploring. We might think of Rachel Carson, for example, and her work on the coast, on the edge of the sea. Under the Sea Wind, I think, is a really interesting example, which kind of uses the wild animal story to explore coastal ecology. But the thing about the wild animal story is that it was much challenged because it has this sort of anthropomorphic focus on the hero animal, and she doesn't do that because she's an ecologist. So her narrative just moves from animal to human to animal, and it has no central character. And so it completely bombed in sales. But it's really exciting and interesting because it's taking this old form, this existing convention, and yet it's kind of developing that. It's just trying to do something innovative with that form. So I think that as much as these forms are inherited from a kind of past experience of nature, there's something prospective as well. They're also struggling for new ways of articulating these new landscapes that we're experiencing. So I think we should be wary of dismissing nature writing as nostalgia. I think we should look for its prospective orientations as well as its retrospective orientations. There you go. I did have an answer in the end. Does anyone else want to chip in on that idea? Because I think it's quite a pressing issue for nature writing at the moment.
I think, one of the things that strikes me is that if you look at nature writing traditions in other places, the commitments are very different, of course. And I've taken a lot of interest in Taiwanese nature writing, which is explicitly political, right? It was shaped and emerged within democratic, like struggles for democracy and within environmental activism. And in a way, that's a nature writing that formed in at the risk of being denatured in that landscape, right? At the risk of loss, at the risk of things really being, being damaged and degraded. And I do wonder where that, I guess that fighting spirit is on the flip side for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Cocker isn't here with us, but he's written a lot on this, and he has gone on record as saying that he himself has qualms about the direction of contemporary British nature writing functioning as a kind of cultural palliative, as a consolation exercise. Because of course we can see things disappearing really in front of, we see the natural capital of the country, although actually I don't like that term, sorry, so let's scratch that. I didn't say natural capital, nature, disappearing literally in front of our eyes. But you could argue, well, perhaps all the more reason in that, writing, think of the great reportage writers, writing flourishes in conflict or in times when the chips are down. And part of nature writing might be a kind of memorial exercise, a bit like the chroniclers of dying civilizations like Felipe Huaman Puma in Peru or Bartolomé de las Casas in Mexico and Central America. You can't help, you are alive at this time of disintegration, and so you have to bear witness. So I know that's not actually, a lot of nature writing isn't that politically charged, but certainly Marx is. So I think, yeah, I'm paraphrasing Mark to an extent, but his argument resonates with me.
I think Marx is also an interesting example of a form that feels quite innovative. Our place is very poetic, but it's also polemical. It's that wonderful combination of the poetic and the polemical. Another question's just come in. Virginia Farman has asked, please could you talk about how the way you imagine nature rather than landscape or place impacts and is impacted by emotion and feeling?
Very good question.
I mean, I guess in terms of, because as we're talking about feeling and emotion, I guess poetry, for me, I suppose, when you're encountering nature, if you're encountering the natural world, if you're looking at a bird or you're responding to a water reed or something, it is a way to empathize with the universal and not just the particular. There are ways to, I guess, to, in that domain of unsettledness and ambiguity, to think about things other than the place that you are in. And I guess poetry has always done that. And so one of the reasons, I guess, landscape writing and writing eco poetry, for example, which centers the non-human, is a way of really proliferating thought and feeling, and trying to transmute that into language. And I guess poetry for me feels the most natural way of being able to do that.
Yeah, I'm with this question. I guess the question I have is at what point can I think about nature, so to speak, without thinking about it in terms of landscape or place? Like I think because I'm a pretty strong rejecter of sort of the dualism between sort of humans and nature, and I do wonder how else I could approach it other than through the lens of embodiment in place and responding very directly to that sort of sense of landscape and being in the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, in that as a writer, you have to ask, well, where are my allegiances? You know, to an extent, it is a political question. Why am I doing this? Is it a form of advocacy, which sounds very worthy, but I agree. That's what I honestly think. That's what writing about the more than human or not only human world is. It's a form of attentiveness, even radical attentiveness. And that's a title, by the way, of a book that one of our questioners, Julia Bell, has just written, which is a sort of manifesto really for just being in the world, as both Jessica and Mona have said, being in the world as we can only be human beings, unfortunately. You know, that's what we are. And what we do have is our subjectivity, which is infinitely variegated. And it's about how to not make, certainly one of my own struggles is how to not make this too much about me, because I am just a perceiver. I'm here as an amanuensis or a proxy for other people, for all humanity. And I realize that sounds incredibly worthy, but to an extent, I think that's what we're all doing. We have to be doing that to produce meaningful work.
Great, thanks, Jean. A question here from Amy Jane Beer as well. Hi, Amy. To what extent are comfort and discomfort in wild places useful or instructive to you as writers? If you could choose to always be comfortable or always be slightly on edge, which would it be?
I think Amy Jane probably knows my answer to this, which is that I really, really quite like being uncomfortable. But I think, I think that's productive on a very creative level for me. I think because at least the way I tend to approach this kind of writing is on very visceral terms, right? And in the way that Jean said, if we're making a sort of we're bearing witness, we're making a record like that, I think is really, for me, driven so much by the sort of physicality of being in place. And discomfort is really, perhaps at times problematic, but for me has been very productive in terms of giving me lots to write about. I don't know how much there is of interest to write about comfort.
I think that I can't imagine ever writing a poem and feeling comfortable. If I'm feeling comfortable in a poem, then something's gone wrong. I mean, I think that it's that sort of getting to the edge of something, actually, and it's sort of, it when you sort of feel it, I think, and I think sometimes it's sort of to the edge of your perception of something. That terrain is quite interesting to mine, I think, for work and for language and for syntax, actually, just to sort of see how far you can go, and then maybe take yourself back if you need to. But I think those, I mean, I was talking earlier about, foreignness, for example, this idea of foreignness. And I want to sort of go back to that again, because I think that is uncomfortable. It feels really uncomfortable. Yet it is that it's an opportunity as well to write from that feeling of of discomfort and feeling on the edge, and also gives you something else. I think it gives you this sort of hypervigilance, I think, that you kind of need. Your sort of antennae are up, and that discomfort is a sort of zone of creativity that I think that you can really mine. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really incredibly well expressed, very eloquent, both of you. And the only thing I have to offer is a very lighthearted anecdote. I'm afraid it's the year I got my fellowship to the Antarctic. There weren't very many fellowships for writers. They were Arts Council fellowships, and they were all for visual. There was a huge number and really impressive array of international fellowships for visual artists. I really, really wished I was one. So there were 2 for writers. One was to a castle in Tuscany, run by a Contessa, who I think still runs it, so I won't say any more. I'm sure it's a wonderful experience. And the other was to Antarctica. And I applied to go to Antarctica, and some of my writer friends just said, why did you do that? What are you going to write about? You're going to write about being cold. And I'd spent my childhood freezing almost to death. So why are you doing that? It's going to be so uncomfortable, and you're going to have nothing to write about. So yeah, and it was. But as you know, as both Mona and Jessica have said, writing comes out of tension to an extent, and we are ourselves a kind of experiments as writers. You use yourself, hopefully without being masochistic about it, as an experiment to get beyond yourself and get into a realm of knowledge that you might not otherwise have. And I think that does require some discomfort.
Great, thank you all. Of course, now all the questions are coming flooding in, just as we're approaching the end. And hasn't this half an hour gone very, very quickly? I think, bearing in mind that we have another panel coming up, we'll probably have to call it a day there. But huge thanks both to all of you at home who have been listening and sending in your questions, and to Jessica, Mona and Jean again for responding to your questions with such interesting and thoughtful responses. So wherever you may be, please put your hands together for these 3 wonderful speakers. And I hope you will come and join us for the question and answer session for our States of Emergency panel. And after that, join us for Timdy and Kathleen Jamie in conversation this evening as well. So once again, thanks to all of you.
Thanks so much, Jos.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jos.